Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When James Carter inherited his family's ancestral home, he dreamed of restoring its charm and moving his family into a house filled with history and love. But one phone call shattered that vision. His cherished home had been demolished. What followed was a battle for justice against a ruthless HOA determined to take everything. James Carter was a man who had always dreamed of owning a place where he could feel rooted, a home that carried history and meaning. That dream seemed to come true a year ago when he inherited his late grandfather's two-story colonial home, nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The house, with its ivy-covered veranda and weathered shutters, had been in the Carter family for generations, a symbol of endurance through decades of change. James had only visited the house once since the inheritance. At that time, he brought along a professional contractor to assess the condition of the property. The structure was sound, but it was clear the house needed significant repairs. The roof sagged in places, the paint was peeling, and the hardwood floors groaned with age. The contractor's estimate confirmed James's suspicion. It would take a substantial investment to restore the house to its former glory. The timing couldn't have been worse. James had just moved his wife, Sarah, and their 5-year-old son, Tommy, to a modest Chicago apartment. His job as a financial analyst was steady but not lucrative, and most of their income went to covering living expenses. Though his heart ached to breathe new life into the family home, James knew he had to be patient. "First, we save," he told Sarah one evening, the house's faded image staring back at him from an old photograph on the coffee table. "Then we'll make it ours." Over the next year, James worked tirelessly, taking on additional projects at work to grow their savings. In the evenings, he often found himself daydreaming about the house. He imagined Tommy playing in the sun-dappled yard and Sarah planting flowers along the driveway, just like his grandmother had done decades ago. The thought of restoring his family's legacy filled him with determination. Finally, after a year of sacrifice and careful planning, the moment arrived. The savings account was ready, and so was James. On a crisp Monday morning, he called the same contractor who had inspected the house a year earlier. They discussed the renovation details, from re-shingling the roof to repairing the porch's wooden banisters. By the end of the call, the contractor had a clear plan and a team scheduled to start work the following day. "Let's make it happen," James said, his voice brimming with excitement as he hung up the phone. That evening, he shared the news with Sarah and Tommy over dinner. "We're one step closer to moving into our family home," he said, unable to hide the pride in his voice. The next morning, James waved goodbye to Sarah and Tommy as they left for work and school, then sat down at his desk, ready to tackle another day in the office. His phone buzzed just as he was about to dive into his emails. Seeing the contractor's number, he smiled and picked up, expecting an update on the team's arrival. Instead, the voice on the other end was tense, almost frantic. "Mr. Carter," the contractor began, "we have a serious problem at the site." James's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of problem?" he asked, his voice tight. "It's your house," the contractor replied. "It's gone. Someone demolished it." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap, shattering the idyllic vision James had nurtured for so long. For a moment, he couldn't process what he'd just heard. His family's legacy, the home he had waited so patiently to restore, had been reduced to rubble. "Gone," he repeated, his voice cracking. "Yes," the contractor confirmed. "There's nothing left but a pile of debris. You need to come here immediately." James grabbed his keys, his mind reeling with disbelief. The excitement and hope he had felt just hours earlier now gave way to a storm of questions and dread. Who could have done this? Why? And what would he find when he arrived at the site that had once been his family's sanctuary? The drive to the property was a blur for James. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel, every passing mile heightening his anxiety. When he turned onto the narrow street leading to his family's land, his heart sank at the sight of a plume of dust rising from where his house once stood. The familiar outline of the colonial-style home was gone, replaced by a chaotic mess of shattered wood, crumbled brick, and mangled debris. His family's heritage had been reduced to a desolate wasteland. James parked on the edge of the property and stepped out, his legs unsteady beneath him. The air was thick with the acrid smell of diesel and dirt. The rumble of machinery echoed in his ears as he spotted a yellow bulldozer idling nearby, its bucket still dusted with remnants of the house. Several men in hard hats stood huddled near the equipment, exchanging nervous glances as James approached. "Who's in charge here?" James demanded, his voice sharp and cracking with emotion. His eyes darted from one worker to another, searching for answers. A man in a neon safety vest stepped forward hesitantly. "That'd be me," he said, pulling off his hard hat to reveal a head of thinning gray hair. "Name's Rick. Look, I'm just doing what I was told. This demolition was scheduled and approved by the HOA. We've got paperwork." "Paperwork?" James barked, incredulous. "This is my house, my property. No one had any right to touch it, let alone destroy it." Rick fished a clipboard from the passenger seat of his truck and handed it over. "I don't know the details, Mr. Carter. We just followed the orders. It's all here." James's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. There it was, a supposed authorization for the demolition, bearing his name and a signature he instantly recognized as a forgery. His breath hitched. Someone had stolen his identity and used it to sanction the obliteration of his family's legacy. Before James could respond, a sleek black SUV pulled up, kicking up a fresh cloud of dust. Out stepped a woman in a tailored blazer and sunglasses, exuding an air of authority. Her presence immediately commanded attention. "Mr. Carter, I presume," she said, removing her sunglasses to reveal cold, calculating eyes. "I'm Karen Blaine, president of the newly formed HOA overseeing this neighborhood." James turned toward her, fury flashing in his eyes. "You're responsible for this," he shouted, gesturing to the wreckage behind him. Karen raised an eyebrow, unperturbed by his anger. "The HOA acted within its rights, Mr. Carter. This house was in severe disrepair and didn't meet the aesthetic or safety standards of the community. It was an eyesore and a liability." "This is my property," James roared, taking a step closer. "You had no right to touch it. That house belonged to my family for generations." Karen smirked, holding up a manila folder. "According to these documents, the property was transferred under HOA jurisdiction last year. And," she added, flipping through the papers, "you signed off on the demolition yourself." James snatched the folder from her hands, his mind racing. "This is a forgery," he spat. "I never signed anything. This is theft." Karen's smirk widened. "If you believe that, I suggest you take it up with our legal team. But I should warn you, Mr. Carter, HOAs have extensive resources, and the courts rarely side with property owners in situations like this." The casual confidence in her tone sent a chill through James. She wasn't just dismissing his outrage. She was daring him to fight back, secure in her belief that she would win. Before he could reply, the rumble of an approaching sheriff's car broke the tension. Sheriff Marcus Clayton, a man with a weathered face and a reputation for fairness, stepped out and surveyed the scene. "Mr. Carter," the sheriff greeted, tipping his hat. "Got your call. What's going on here?" "This," James said, gesturing to the devastation, "was my home. They destroyed it without my consent." Karen stepped forward smoothly. "Sheriff, this was all legally sanctioned by the HOA. We have the documents to prove it." Sheriff Clayton frowned, taking the papers from Karen and skimming them. He glanced at James, then back at the rubble. "I'll need to take a closer look at these and consult with the county records office," he said evenly. "In the meantime, I'm putting a stop to all further activity on this property until we sort this out." Karen's confident facade flickered for a moment before she regained her composure. "Of course, Sheriff," she said, her tone syrupy sweet. "We'll cooperate fully." As the sheriff left, James stood among the ruins, his fists clenched at his sides. The image of his destroyed home burned into his memory. This wasn't just about a house. This was about justice, family, and holding people like Karen accountable. For the first time since arriving, a clear thought crystallized in his mind. He would fight back, no matter the cost. The day after the demolition, James sat in his modest Chicago apartment, his head buried in his hands. The weight of what had happened crushed him. His family's legacy, a home that had stood for generations, was gone. But as the initial shock began to subside, his resolve hardened. Karen Blaine and the HOA had trampled on his rights, and he was determined to fight back. His first call was to Ellen Price, an attorney with a reputation for taking on HOAs and winning. Ellen was a sharp, no-nonsense lawyer known for her tenacity in defending property owners. When James explained the situation, her voice on the other end of the line grew cold and focused. HOAs like this thrive on intimidation and exploiting loopholes, Ellen said. If what you're saying is true, they've crossed multiple legal boundaries. We'll start by verifying the records and proving that the documents they used are fraudulent. The next morning, Ellen and James met in her downtown office, a space lined with thick law books and framed certificates. Ellen spread out the manila folder Karen had provided at the demolition site, along with property deeds and other records James had brought. She scrutinized every detail, her pen tapping rhythmically against her desk. "Here," Ellen said, pointing to the forged signature. "This is where we start. The style of the signature doesn't match the one on your official documents. It's sloppy, and I'll bet we can prove it's a forgery with handwriting analysis. But that's not all. Look at this." She held up another paper, supposedly granting the HOA jurisdiction over James's property. "This claim hinges on a zoning amendment filed 6 months ago. I'll need to dig deeper, but I suspect they manipulated the county zoning office to pull this off. If that's true, we're dealing with more than just forgery. This could be criminal fraud." James nodded grimly. "They didn't just take my house, they took my family's history. That property was everything to us." Ellen's expression softened slightly. "We'll make them pay for this, James, but first, we need more evidence." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Ellen filed a formal complaint with the county clerk's office, requesting access to zoning changes, title transfers, and any communications involving the HOA. At the same time, James began gathering everything he could to strengthen his case. He unearthed family photographs showing the home in its former glory, receipts from property taxes he had paid since inheriting the house, and even the inspection report from his initial visit with the contractor. As Ellen worked through the legal labyrinth, James decided to confront Karen directly. He arrived unannounced at the HOA office, a gleaming building that stood in stark contrast to the ruins of his family home. Karen was sitting behind a polished oak desk, her manicured fingers tapping away at a keyboard. "Mr. Carter," she said with a thin smile, barely glancing up. "I assume you're here to drop this futile charade." James's jaw tightened. "I'm here to tell you that I'm not backing down. I've hired a lawyer, and we're going to prove you fabricated the documents. You destroyed my house. You'll pay for this." Karen leaned back in her chair, her smile turning into a smirk. "You're welcome to try, but I hope you understand that HOAs have resources, deep resources. Fighting us won't be easy. And even if you win, what's your end game? You can't rebuild the past, Mr. Carter." Her words stung, but James refused to show it. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "You think this is just about the house? This is about justice. It's about stopping you from doing this to anyone else." Karen's smirk faltered for a moment before she recovered. "Good luck," she said coldly. Outside, James clenched his fists, rage boiling beneath his surface. He knew Karen's confidence wasn't just arrogance. She truly believed she was untouchable. But Ellen's call later that day brought a glimmer of hope. "We've got something," Ellen said. "There's a trail of emails between Karen and a contact at the county zoning office. They discuss the timely inclusion of your property into HOA boundaries right around the time you inherited it. This isn't just a civil matter, James. This is criminal." Hearing those words, James felt the first stirrings of vindication. It wouldn't bring his house back, but it was a step toward justice. He knew the fight would be long and grueling, but for the first time since the demolition, he believed it was a fight he could win. As the investigation deepened, the scale of the HOA's manipulation began to emerge. Ellen's team unearthed a web of deceit that spanned beyond James's case. Documents from the county zoning office revealed that Karen Blaine had been working closely with a corrupt official to alter property boundaries. James's land had been falsely absorbed into the HOA's jurisdiction under a zoning amendment passed 6 months after his grandfather's death, during the fragile transition of ownership. But the most damning evidence came in the form of emails. Ellen handed James a printed chain of correspondence, her expression grim. "Karen didn't just forge your signature. She coordinated this entire scheme, knowing you weren't paying close attention to the property. Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "Carter's place is low-hanging fruit," Karen wrote to her contact in the zoning office. The family hasn't been around in months, and it's a perfect site for our new community center. Push the paperwork through. I'll handle the fallout later." James felt his blood boil as he read the words. Karen hadn't just targeted his property. She had coldly calculated every move, banking on his distance and distraction to get away with it. Meanwhile, the HOA launched a counteroffensive. A week after Ellen submitted her findings to the county prosecutor, James received a formal notice accusing him of neglecting his property and violating community standards. The notice cited everything from overgrown grass to unsafe structures as justification for HOA intervention. "This is absurd," James said, pacing Ellen's office. "The house wasn't unsafe. It was in the middle of a planned renovation." "They're trying to discredit you," Ellen said calmly. "It's a classic tactic. If they can paint you as negligent, they'll argue that their actions were for the greater good. But we've got them on forged documents and zoning fraud. Don't lose focus." The tension escalated when James visited the property again to document the damage. As he walked through the debris, his heart sank further. His grandfather's old rocking chair, once a fixture on the front porch, lay broken in the rubble. Nearby, the remnants of a family photo album had been trampled into the dirt. It was a personal violation that stung even more than the loss of the house itself. Then James found something that made his stomach churn. Parked at the edge of the property, almost as if taunting him, was the HOA's promotional banner. It advertised the future Karen Blaine Community Center, a sleek, modern facility that was slated to take the place of his family home. The audacity left James speechless. "They're already celebrating," James said bitterly, showing Ellen a photo of the banner. "They think they've won." Ellen studied the image, her eyes narrowing. "That's their arrogance talking," she said, "and it'll be their downfall. They've put this plan in writing, from the zoning changes to the construction contracts. All we need is to connect the dots in court." But the HOA wasn't done with its dirty tricks. Late one evening, as James reviewed case files at home, he received a call from Sheriff Clayton. "James," the sheriff began, his voice heavy with concern, "I need you to know there's been another complaint. Someone reported you for improperly storing hazardous materials on the property." "What?" James exclaimed, standing up in disbelief. "That's impossible. There's nothing like that there." The sheriff sighed. "I figured as much, but I have to follow protocol. We'll need to send an inspector out." The next morning, James arrived at the site to meet the inspector, only to find a small pile of suspicious-looking barrels dumped near the rubble. His mind raced as he realized what had happened. Someone had planted the barrels to frame him. "This is Karen's doing," James said, his voice tight with rage. "Don't touch anything," Ellen advised when James called her. "This plays right into their hands if we react rashly. Document everything, and we'll prove it's a setup." As the pressure mounted, James's determination grew. He knew he was up against a well-funded and deeply entrenched system, but the mounting evidence in his favor gave him hope. Ellen was relentless, gathering testimony from former HOA members who had left due to Karen's heavy-handed tactics. One former board member revealed that Karen routinely used intimidation to silence dissent and fabricated complaints to seize properties she deemed valuable. James began to see the bigger picture. Karen's ambition wasn't just about controlling the neighborhood. It was about building her own empire at any cost. For James, this fight was no longer just about justice for his family. It was about exposing Karen and dismantling the corrupt system she had built. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the trial, a mix of curious locals, HOA supporters, and James's own allies who had rallied around him as the case gained attention. James sat beside Ellen at the plaintiff's table, his heart pounding as the judge called the court to order. This was the moment everything would come to light. Ellen wasted no time. She began by presenting the fraudulent documents that Karen had used to justify the demolition. Expert testimony from a forensic document examiner confirmed that James's signature on the HOA agreements had been forged. The examiner pointed out the discrepancies in handwriting, providing a detailed analysis that left no room for doubt. Next, Ellen turned to the emails. As she read Karen's correspondence aloud, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. The most damning exchange revealed Karen's intent to seize James's property for a community center, describing it as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. It was cold, calculated, and completely incriminating. Karen's defense attempted to argue that the HOA had acted in the community's best interest, citing James's absence from the property and the alleged neglect. But Ellen countered with photographs, receipts, and timelines showing James's plans for renovation and his consistent payment of property taxes. Each point dismantled the HOA's claims piece by piece. The turning point came during Karen's cross-examination. Ellen's questions were sharp and unrelenting. Karen initially maintained her composure, but as Ellen pressed her on the forged documents and the zoning changes, her answers grew evasive. Finally, Ellen revealed a newly uncovered email in which Karen admitted to fabricating evidence to expedite the demolition. "Ms. Blaine," Ellen said, her voice steady but firm, "isn't it true that you manipulated zoning records, forged documents, and acted without the rightful owner's consent to carry out the demolition of Mr. Carter's home?" Karen's face flushed. "I was acting in the community's interest," she snapped. "Answer the question," Ellen demanded. After a tense silence, Karen's voice faltered. "Yes," she admitted, barely above a whisper. The courtroom erupted. The judge's gavel banged repeatedly, restoring order. But the damage to Karen's case was done. In closing arguments, Ellen painted a vivid picture of the violation James had endured, the destruction of his family's legacy, and the blatant abuse of power by Karen and the HOA. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room buzzed with anticipation. It didn't take long. Within an hour, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict in James's favor. Karen was found guilty of fraud, forgery, and trespass. The HOA was held liable for damages, and the judge issued a scathing rebuke of their actions, warning that their abuse of power would not be tolerated. Karen's downfall was cemented as the judge ordered her arrest on criminal charges. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, James felt a surge of relief. Justice had been served, but the fight had taken a toll. Still, he knew this victory was bigger than just his home. It was a message that no one was above the law. The courtroom victory marked the beginning of the end for Karen Blaine and her corrupt HOA. Following the trial, the judge ordered a hefty financial settlement in James's favor. The compensation covered the demolition of his family home, legal expenses, and significant punitive damages for the emotional and material harm he had endured. Additionally, the HOA was forced to issue a public apology, acknowledging their misconduct and pledging to overhaul their leadership and practices. Karen, now facing multiple criminal charges, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for forgery, fraud, and trespassing. Her once commanding demeanor had crumbled, replaced by the quiet resignation of someone who had finally been held accountable for years of unchecked abuse. Her downfall sent shockwaves through the community, with other HOA members distancing themselves from her and demanding transparency moving forward. For James, the compensation wasn't just about rebuilding, it was about honoring his family's legacy. With Ellen's continued guidance, he hired a team of skilled architects and builders to recreate his ancestral home. Every detail, from the hand-carved banisters to the ivy-covered veranda, was restored with painstaking care. The project became a labor of love, a tribute to his grandfather and the generations who had called the house home. James also planted a new garden, filling it with saplings and flowers his grandmother once tended. Among them stood a young oak tree, a replacement for the one that had been destroyed during the demolition. To him, it symbolized resilience and new beginnings. When the house was complete, James invited Sarah and Tommy to see their future home. Tommy raced through the halls, his laughter echoing in the freshly painted rooms, while Sarah stood in awe, tears in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she whispered, wrapping her arms around James. "You brought it back to life." Standing on the porch as the sun set over the restored property, James felt a deep sense of peace. The fight had been long and grueling, but it was worth every moment. His family's history, once threatened, had not only been preserved, but strengthened. He knew this house, now more than ever, was a place of hope, resilience, and belonging. The aftermath of James's victory rippled far beyond his own property. The trial exposed deep flaws in how the HOA operated, prompting a county-wide review of homeowner associations and their powers. New regulations were enacted to protect property owners from similar abuses, including stricter oversight of zoning amendments and mandatory transparency in HOA decision-making. James's case became a cornerstone for change, inspiring others to stand up against overreach. With his home restored, James turned his attention to helping others who had suffered under similar circumstances. He joined forces with Ellen to establish a nonprofit organization called Guardians of Home, dedicated to defending homeowners from exploitation. Their mission was clear: to educate property owners on their rights and provide legal support for those in need. Locally, the HOA underwent a complete restructuring. Karen's replacement, a soft-spoken but earnest leader, pledged to rebuild trust with the community. The newly elected board focused on collaboration rather than control, and the neighborhood began to heal from the scars of Karen's reign. For James, life on his restored property was a balance of reflection and forward momentum. He often found himself walking the grounds, planting new seeds in the garden, or sitting under the young oak tree he had planted, a symbol of renewal. The laughter of Sarah and Tommy echoed through the halls of the home, a sound that reminded him of why he had fought so hard. James's story became a testament to resilience and justice. His victory wasn't just for his family, it was for everyone who had ever been told they were powerless. Through his perseverance, he proved that even the mightiest systems could be challenged and reformed, one determined step at a time.